This is the Sports Bash Warm-Up with Josh Hennig on 97.3 ESPN. Now, live inside the Matt Black Kia Studios, here's Josh Hennig.
Thanks to the pandemic, there's a possibility that NFL teams won't care about potential in the NFL draft. Yes, that is a real possibility in 2020. Josh Hennig here on the warm-up on 97.3 ESPN, along with Ryan Rothstein. Ryan, how you doing on this day after crazy wins?
I'm good, man. Like you said before we jumped on the air, no more candlelight, for me at least. All right, I got lights, I have TV, I have internet. Everything's good. I'm still rocking the mask, but at least we have power today. I hope everyone else out there is somewhat back to normal if you were impacted yesterday by those crazy winds.
Yeah, so I didn't have power last night. I slept in with a candlelight, and I woke up this morning, had to go get my coffee from Wawa, like instead of making my own, and came into the station a little disheveled looking. But I'm here.
So
I'm
normal.
Good. I'm good to go. Well, semi-normal. Listen, we got a bunch we want to get into today. The text board is open, 609-403-0973. As Ryan said, we hope everyone is safe and okay out there. You know, not just the pandemic, but because of the weather we had yesterday. Obviously, we want to get to the NFL draft because the NFL yesterday came out with their proposal for how teams are going to handle a virtual offseason. Now, for those who may not fully know, this isn't the first time the NFL has had no offseason. 2011 lockout. They had no mini camps, no OTAs, no pre- or post-draft rookie camps, nothing. Everyone just showed up the day of training camp at the end of July, early August. It looks like the NFL is planning a similar timetable for this year. But part of the virtual offseason is that the NFL is going to have coaches give tutorials on the playbook. Now, this is an interesting conversation, Ryan, because with the NFL draft coming in a couple weeks, there's a lot of NFL and draft experts who are saying that we could be looking at an NFL draft where potential is less important as what they're referring to as FBI, football IQ.
So basically what we're saying there, teams are scared. Teams are going to play it safe for this upcoming draft due to the wide array of factors that are limiting their typical draft process, right? Like teams are going to want to play it safe. But I think that question that you bring to the table is interesting for me because how much has the draft process evolved over the years? And the reason why I ask that question is because, well, how does this pandemic impact this year's draft? You know, you say potential is out the window now, to paraphrase. And it's like, well, how much of that has really changed? Have teams always been now, as we go, you know, later into the years here, it's the year 2020, how heavy on the scale, I guess, does potential typically weigh in your mind, Josh?
Well, I think that in the past, a lot of teams felt maybe that potential was more important because maybe they felt they could develop a guy, they could work a guy into their system. Like, for example, you know, there's a lot of times that teams will draft running backs, and then when they get them in the camp, they're teaching them more pro concepts when it comes to blocking, catching out of the backfield, route running, you know, how to hit the hole, the timing of hitting the hole. Like, we know about the Corey Clement story back in 2017 that Deuce Stanley told him, listen, I need you to come into training camp at X weight. I need you to work on your hands. I need you to do this. I need you to do that. Corey Clement did everything he was asked, and then it had a huge impact on the Super Bowl year and in the Super Bowl. So we know that there's a lot of times in the NFL where teams, whether they're drafting a guy or signing an undrafted free agent, maybe they're not just grabbing the guy purely based on what he can do immediately, but what they could project him to do.
Absolutely. I mean, the NBA, and I'm not going to get down an NBA rabbit hole, but it's worthy to bring up for this conversation because we know, Josh, the NBA and that draft is really, I mean, it's all potential.
Oh, 100%.
I mean, even it is 100% potential. I mean, even Zion Williamson, who we've debated and talked about a lot, #1 overall pick, a bona fide star in college, this and that. he's still 18 years old. He still has a lot of growth that you don't know what's going to come of it. So like that sport is 100% potential. The NFL, I don't know. Like in the first round, how crazy are teams really getting with their draft picks? Because they need to typically fill a void. I mean, unless you're the 30th pick, even then you still probably need to fill a void. So I just think it's interesting now with this pandemic. Do teams get a little bit too scared, right? Do they not properly adapt to the circumstances around them? And then how it relates to the Eagles, how does Howie Roseman in the front office and Doug Peterson potentially capitalize on all of that?
So let's give a non-Eagles example before we dig into the Eagles, because I think, Ryan, and people can text in at 609-403-0973, I think this situation is going to impact the Eagles greatly when it comes to who they draft to play wide receiver. Before we get to the Eagles, I want to give a non-Eagles example. So for those who don't know, Jordan Love of Utah State is one of the top quarterback prospects in this year's draft. Now, depending on whose board you look at, he's in everybody's top 5. Depending on where he is in that top 5, depends on what draft expert you ask. But one of the problems with Jordan Love, Ryan, is that this previous year he led Division I college football, the FBS level, in interceptions. But the year before, he had a very good season. So he went from having this great season statistically and on film to a rough season statistically on film. And there's a lot of teams that look at him as a project. They're saying, look, this guy can be an NFL quarterback and maybe he needs to sit behind somebody. Well, maybe we had a regular offseason. Maybe teams work him out. Maybe he becomes maybe even higher than Tua because of his potential. But because we're only looking at potential right now, there's a possibility that he might not even be a top 10 or top 15 pick. He could drop to a team like, for example, the Patriots because of the fact that teams are worried about getting guys into their camp and into their system fast enough.
Yeah, and I think that's the most intriguing part with all this and how it relates to the pandemic. It's like, how much are teams going to adjust? Like I said before, you mentioned Jordan Love. Okay, so now because he can't travel and he can't have these workouts and the process isn't how it usually is that really going to impact it? Like you look at teams' needs, and that's something that is a major factor, as it always is, but really with the NFL. Like you have to look at which need do I really have to address? And without players being allowed to travel and have those workouts, maybe it simplifies things for these teams, right? Like maybe they don't bring in a Jordan Love, or Jordan Love doesn't end up at the practice facility or whatever working out. And instead of saying, man, this kid's much better than we thought, or we can do something here, maybe we're going to have to go here instead of a linebacker or whatever it is. Now I think it's just almost like doing a fantasy football draft with your buddies. All right, number one need is a cornerback. Let's go get the guy with a medical history that's clean, available, and hopefully ready to play. Like the safe bet. That's the bottom line. It's like sports gambling. It's like fantasy football. Give me the safest, sure thing.
And that's where the Eagles get involved in this, because I think that who they pick in the first round is going to have a major, not just their pick, but the picks before them. Because when you look at the wide receiver, and I'm going to make the assumption, Ryan, I think you would agree with this, because they didn't sign anybody in free agency, I'm working off the assumption that the Eagles are looking at the wide receiver heavy in the draft. We may see 2 wide receivers in the first 3 or 4 rounds. I think definitely in the first round. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with it, but there's one wild card here. Howie Roseman. I mean, this guy, he came out, I think it was maybe a month ago at this point, maybe 2-3 weeks, whenever it was. But he even came out on record, Josh, and said the following, paraphrasing, I wasn't planning on doing everything that I ended up doing here for the defensive side of the ball. Mm-hmm. But there were opportunities. There were players that were made available that maybe wasn't expecting to be made available. And Howie being Howie, he got his best value for his dollar, as he thinks at least. So now with all these moves that he made and the Eagles front office make on defense, you have to imagine wide receiver is the number one priority. But like you said, how does the circumstance of the pandemic impact it? And how do the teams ahead of the Eagles impact their decision and their pick with the number one or the first round draft pick?
Yeah, and for example, we know guys like Jerry Jeudy, CeeDee Lamb, they're the most like sure bets people consider in the draft. And I'm assuming that because of a lot of variables, teams may look at the wide receiver position a little differently. We know there's a lot of teams that need wide receiver aside from the Eagles, and maybe because in the past teams looked at certain quarterbacks and they got drafted higher, maybe certain quarterbacks drop and other players move up. Are wide receivers one of those players that moves up? So if Jerry Jeudy, CeeDee Lamb, and Henry Ruggs are all gone by the time, let's say, the 18th overall pick is, right? Well, then is there another team that trades up to get a Justin Jefferson ahead of the Eagles? Should the Eagles even draft a guy like Jefferson, because Jefferson is projected to be more of a slot receiver than an outside receiver? We know a guy like Denzel Mims is more of a project guy than a plug-and-play guy. Does he drop in the draft? Maybe even the second round where the Eagles could get him because of the fact that teams are concerned about him being able to play immediately. There's a lot of variables with these wide receivers. And don't forget, no one can actually give him medical evaluations. So a guy, for example, like Colorado's Laviska Shenault, he's coming off an injury, Ryan. Nobody can actually bring him into their facility and check him out themselves.
Exactly. And then how does that factor limit the Philadelphia Eagles and every other team? Here's the thing. Has Howie Roseman backed himself into a corner here, especially with the circumstances of this year's NFL draft? Jeudy, CeeDee Lamb, and Ruggs are pretty much the consensus top three wide receivers in this year's NFL draft. Number 4, as you mentioned, Jefferson from LSU is probably 4th on most people's wide receiver board.
Right.
Picking 21, Jeudy, Lamb, and Ruggs, let's just say hypothetically go off the board before 21, and most people would agree with that statement. A team can leapfrog the Eagles at 21 and really screw over Howie and really put the Eagles in a bind. Like, is there pressure on Howie to trade up from that 21 spot now because of the moves and lack of moves that have been made?
Or how about this? Is there a possibility if someone trades ahead of the Eagles and maybe picks a certain receiver, the Eagles could then trade down, recoup some picks, because they're looking at maybe some of the other guys and saying, maybe these guys don't fit what we want. For example, what's one of the things the Eagles lacked the most last year? Speed, right? Well,
sure.
A guy like T. Higgins is not a speed receiver at all. A guy like I said, Laviska Shenault, he's a great physical receiver, but he's not a speed guy. Is there a possibility, Ryan, that when you look at the Eagles, you look at them and say, there's a possibility they might not even stay put, because in order for them to get the best fit for the team next year, and if they need speed, it's avoiding another Alshon Jeffrey physical body kind out there?
Howie Roseman has yet to really prove to me, and maybe, correct me if I'm wrong here, if I'm missing something. He doesn't seem like he's ever willing to go get a guy in the NFL draft. Like, he's pretty safe and calculated with his draft choices and everything he does. That's partly what makes him great, but I think it could be a weakness at times too, because he just doesn't seem like a guy that's going to say, you know what, I'm gonna give away some draft capital because Wentz to Ruggs is going to be, a beautiful show for the next 5 to 10 years. Even Wentz to Jefferson, who would be an instant play right away, red zone, move the chains, high volume type of receiver from day one. But maybe Howie's not willing to take that risk. But does this year's circumstances change the approach?
So there's two things I want to point out with that question. So number one, so the Eagles, if we remember right, they did trade up twice for Wentz. So that's a quarterback. So it's a very unique position.
Yeah.
They leaped the Cowboys for Dallas Goedert. So you know two specific instances where he has. But you are right. As an overall, Howie Roseman does not go chasing people very often. Now, the bigger question is, how much of that strategy in the last few years was Howie versus Joe Douglas in the room? This will be the first year that Howie Roseman, in his second tenure with the Eagles front office, because remember before that he got sent to the broom closet by Chip Kelly, you have Joe Douglas as the top advisor for him. Well, now it's Andy Weidel. For those who don't know, Andy Weidel is also from the Baltimore Ravens organization. And when Joe Douglas left for the Jets GM job, Weidel became the new Joe Douglas. So there's a question, though, Ryan. How much of Howie's movement up and down in the draft was Howie versus Douglas? That's my first question.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think any of us really know the answer. If I have to guess, I'd like to say Howie's a big factor in those moves, but those moves are really not relatable to this year. Like, you talk about trading up for Carson Wentz, you're going to get a franchise quarterback. I can't, it's not apples to apples, quarterback versus any other position, even in the dire need of the wide receiver spot the Eagles are in for this draft. It's still much different. And you bring up Dallas Goedert. That's kind of like a savvy little trade up sneaky move in the second round to make sure that your rival, who you play 2 times a year, who you compete every season for the NFC East title against, you don't want them to end up with Dallas Goedert. So you go and get a special talent. And with that offense the Eagles run, they need 2 dynamic tight ends. Like, so that was a different type of situation where now the whole world knows the Eagles need a receiver. They're not picking until the 21st pick. It's a deep wide receiver draft. There's a lot of different avenues the front office and Howie Roseman can go down. And they have to make a decision on, should we be aggressive? Should we be conservative? Should we roll the dice? Or should we get up from the table if you're playing blackjack, so to speak? So
right.
It's really tough to predict how the Eagles are going to navigate this 21st pick in the draft.
Well, and that's my second point of question, and you walked right into it for me, and I appreciate that. You did it without even knowing, and that is, this is known as a historically deep receiver draft, but it's not known as a historically talented draft. There's no Calvin Johnson-esque guy. There's no guy that people look at and say that's the next Odell Beckham Jr. There's a lot of guys who are, maybe their peak, for example, is a T.Y. Hilton or a Jarvis Landry, but maybe not a Calvin Johnson or DeAndre Hopkins. So
we think.
Well, again, I'm just going off what the experts say because they watch more film than I do. So I'm thinking if they're believing that this is not, the top end of the draft is not as elite, is there a possibility, Ryan, the Eagles look at Ruggs and say, look, we'd love to have him, but if we have the chance to walk away with a late first-round pick and an early second-round pick with 2 wide receivers, is that possibly of more value than trading up for just one guy?
I mean, I'll answer the question. No. I don't think it is. Let me just spin it right back to you. I want your thoughts on it. What's the best-case scenario from what you know? You don't know everything. No one does.
Thank goodness I know everything.
Draft,
I wouldn't be here.
Yeah, that's true. What's the best case scenario? For me, the Eagles have to figure out a way to get one of those top 4 guys. Listen, disclaimer, do I hate the potential scenario of the Eagles landing, let's say, KJ Hamler and maybe filling another defensive need with a great talent with the 21st pick and then snaking around in the second pick there and getting Hamler? I don't hate that scenario. But for me, it just feels like the success lies within one of those top 4 wide receivers. Do you agree?
I disagree for this reason. I feel like when you look at this year's draft, whether it's, for me, after the top 3, I would say from the 4th guy to, and I'm just throwing out a number because I'm not going to 100% exact because everybody's draft board is different. From 4 to 12, there's not a huge separation from what, the Daniel Jeremiahs, the Kuipers, the McShays, all those guys are pointing out. So there's not a huge differentiation from, let's say, Justin Jefferson to Chase Claypool from Notre Dame, just putting out 2 names for examples. Mm-hmm. Then there's a part of me that actually likes the idea of walking away with 2 wide receivers late in the first round, early in the second, because if you can walk away from this draft, instead of with Henry Ruggs, I'm just using that as an example, as let's say you can get KJ Hamler and Jalen Reagor, 2 guys who can run, 2 guys who are considered plug-and-play guys. People say KJ Hamler reminds them of T.Y. Hilton. People say that Reagor is a guy who can run for distance, can run routes, can be inside, outside, can do a little bit of everything. So if there's a possibility, I could walk away with 2 top 10 receiver talents in the top 10 ranking of receivers instead of just one. I like the idea of the depth, Ryan.
See, I like it. You sold me a little bit on the idea of the depth, but I still think, like you mentioned, 4 to 12, there may not be that much of a drop-off. Like, to me, that's gambling. Like, you're gambling there because then you really don't know what you're going to get. You could get the 8th best receiver, let's just say hypothetically, and he not turn out to anything. You could get the 4th and he not turn out to anything. Like, why leave it to chance, I guess is my point. If you have an opportunity where you need to be aggressive, I just hope Howie is aggressive. And listen, he has a history of doing that. You know, I talked about when has Howie really been trading up. Well, guess what? 3 of the past 4 drafts, the Eagles have moved either up or back. And 6 times since Roseman became GM in 2010, the Eagles have moved up or back. I just don't want any movement backwards. I think that's my bottom line, Josh.
609-403-0973 is the text board to get on the conversation. We're going to get to your text messages next here on the warm-up on 97.3 ESPN+. Plus, who are 2 of the wide receivers the Eagles have already had Zoom calls with? We're going to give that information to you coming up on the other side here on 97.3 ESPN FM. Again, the text board is open, 609-403-0973. What would you do? Would you move up in the draft, or would you move back to try to get 2 receivers? Let us know, 609-403-0973. Plus, how could a veteran running back joining the Eagles impact their draft strategy as well? There's a possibility, and it's a well-known name. We'll get into that as well coming up here on the warm-up on 97.3 ESPN FM and the 97.3 ESPN mobile app. Text board again open, 609-403-0973. Josh Hennig, Ryan Rothstein here on the warm-up. Some interesting questions that have come in on the text board so far. I wanted to get to them here. We got Bruce from Greenbank. Bruce, appreciate you texting in. Says, do you think that teams are going to try to trade their draft spot for proven players already starting in the NFL rather than take a chance on the more than usual unknowns? Well, it's a good question, Bruce, because of the fact that, Ryan, as we know, for example, the Bills have already traded their first-round pick for Stephon Diggs. The Colts traded their first-round pick to the 49ers for, dang nabbit, I'm forgetting the guy's name off the top of my head, but the defensive lineman. Now I got to check. But they traded for a defensive lineman who's a proven guy, DeForest Buckner. So DeForest Buckner, we've already seen 2 teams trade for proven players. So I don't think it's totally far-fetched, Ryan, that you may see another trade either before the draft or on draft day that involves a proven player. I don't know if that'll be the Eagles, but I wouldn't be surprised if another team does it.
Well, you mentioned Diggs. Like, how many teams have already fulfilled the wide receiver need that they potentially had this offseason that are ahead of the Eagles in the draft? Because I think that's an interesting dynamic.
Well, the Panthers signed Robbie Anderson, and they're ahead of the Eagles in the draft. Let's see here. I don't think the Raiders. I mean, I know the Raiders have been looking at wide receivers, even though they signed a couple guys, but I don't think they've signed like a top tier guys. They're a team that's reportedly looked at Russ because they have multiple first round picks. We mentioned the Bills, but they're kind of in the same range as the Eagles are in the first round. Yeah. So, you know, and of course the Jets, they brought in Rashard Perryman, but I don't know if Perryman really fulfills a number 1 tier receiver need. He's more of like replacing Robbie Anderson on that team. So, you know, not a ton of teams ahead of the Eagles, but again, as you mentioned earlier, Ryan, there is a possibility a team trades ahead of the Eagles as well.
That's what I think. I don't want to say that's what I think is going to happen, but I should say that's what I fear will happen. The Eagles are vulnerable. It's like they're left out in the middle of like a paintball match. They're out of paintballs. Their paintball gun is broken and they have nowhere to hide. Like, that's how I feel about their spot right now and their obvious need for the wide receiver position. are they backed into a corner to make a trade on draft day, or do they get left in the dark here because other teams capitalize on potentially punishing them for their obvious glaring need?
The other thing I think is interesting is that also who ahead of the Eagles maybe picks another position that could affect them. For example, Dan from EHC brings up linebacker. He says, my draft pick for the Eagles would be Murray or Queen at linebacker and then a receiver in the second round. Now, the problem with that, Ryan, is that the two players he's mentioning, Kenneth Murray of Oklahoma and Patrick Queen of LSU, those are two of the top 4 linebackers in the draft. So there's a possibility that neither one of those guys could be available for the Eagles at 21 overall. So you may not have the shot at all to get those guys.
You might not have a shot at a lot of players. Forget the wide receiver position, but any position that have the top 1 or 2 guys at each position. And listen, something that Mike Gill has brought up that him and I have talked about, and he's talked about on his own at times, maybe the Eagles wide receiver position isn't as bad as we think it is. I'm not saying I believe that, but I think it's a fair, point to bring up in this conversation. Like, Deshaun Jackson is coming back. How valuable can he be? Alshon Jeffrey, I know he's going to miss a lot of time, but he will be back as long as he's still with the team. What type of contribution can he make? Can Arcega-Whiteside develop into half the guy they were hoping him to develop in? And if that's the case and you want to roll the dice there, then what opportunities do you have at other positions to really bolster your team?
Right, and also let's not forget that there are multiple rounds in the draft. You don't have to pick a guy in the first round for him to be a contributor. For example, Jarvis Landry is a second-round pick. Does that make him less of a player? No, he's arguably one of the best receivers, and he actually may be a more reliable receiver than his own teammate Odell Beckham Jr. From down game to game. So, you may be able to get a guy like Henry Ruggs. You may miss on him, but you may get a guy who actually is more reliable and more productive for you at the 21 or in the second round.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a million examples that I think we could point to where you see guys that are Hall of Famers, all pros, massive contributors for their team that were not first-round picks, second-round picks, heck, even drafted. I mean, we talk about this whole conversation really started with the virtual impact and the unique circumstances that teams are in with the pandemic this year. But you still can maybe get too punch drunk on, the depth at wide receiver. You got to go receiver in the first round. That's the flashy new toy, the wide receiver position, any year. But maybe we're just a little bit naive or just tunnel vision with the combination of the excitement of the wide receiver position and the Eagles' need at that position.
609-403-0973. We also have multiple texts saying the Eagles need to trade for Ruggs. They need to get Ruggs. Multiple texts. And here's my only caveat with Ruggs. And I'm not diminishing his talent. I'm not diminishing what he can do. But there's a reason why Jerry Jeudy is the number 1 guy on this board. Jerry Jeudy is the most polished route runner in this draft. Ruggs, you are drafting him based on his physical abilities, his running, his athleticism, but he's not the route runner that a Jeudy is or some of these other guys are. There are some people who think that Denzel Mims is a better route runner than Henry Ruggs. So, what is more valuable, just a guy who can run or a guy who actually can play football? Because how many times have we seen the Raiders draft guys like Darius Hayward-Bay because they can run really fast, or John Ross, and these guys really can't play receiver in the NFL.
But then going back to the point we just made a minute ago, you really don't know what you're getting, right? And I think that's the scariest and even funnest part of every draft, every year. And then you throw in all the circumstances and factors with this year's draft. It's like, yes, Ruggs is not a polished route runner. He's not as physically strong as Lamb or Mims, but he's still a 4.27 40, great hand size, large catch radius, doesn't drop balls, Like you have to weigh the pros and cons and figure out how much am I willing to gamble for every single player. It doesn't matter. And I think this draft is really going to be won or lost, as it usually is anyway, in the later rounds. Because the first round, with the limitations on this year's draft, Josh, in my mind, is the easy part. But once you get into day 2, day 3, the later rounds, that's where teams can really be savvy and figure out a way to win the draft, so to speak.
Yeah, and for me, I think that there might be a saving grace in all of this, and that is, you and I talked before the show about a blessing in disguise. A blessing in disguise to me could be that maybe you don't bring a guy in for a workout and you're more stuck with watching his actual game tape instead of focusing on how good he looks in a pair of shorts and a t-shirt. So maybe you don't get sold on the guy's athleticism and you're forced to actually watch more tape of him to make a better evaluation. And then if you're looking at Ruggs, Hamler, Mins, Duvernay, guys who are all under 4.4 speed guys on tape, is Ruggs on tape really better than Mims and Hamler and Duvernay? That's, I think, something these teams have to look at when it comes to evaluation, because when we know that there are guys that they are talking to, maybe them talking to those guys is a sign saying, hey, look, the Eagles, from what we've heard, have not had a Zoom call with Henry Ruggs, but they've had it with other guys. There's a possibility maybe the Eagles already know that they can't get Ruggs, even though Ruggs is somebody that every Eagle fan wants.
Is Ruggs the most hyped up player? Like, you mentioned shorts and t-shirts, game film versus potential, all of the stuff we've been talking about throughout the show. I feel like Ruggs, as you pointed out a little bit a couple minutes ago, is maybe the most hyped up. But maybe that allows the Eagles to land him. like maybe because of the ceiling is really high for him, but the unknown for him could be the highest out of the top 2 to 4 receivers in the draft. So maybe a team does play it too safe ahead of the Eagles, and that allows for them to capitalize. But sidebar, Josh, how aggressive do we want the Eagles to be in that situation? And I think that's what we're trying to work through.
Now, I mentioned before the break, there are multiple reports about players the Eagles have talked to, okay? So I wanted to kind of give the audience an idea, whether it's an Adam Kaplan, a Jeff Mosher who's been on 97.3, whether it's guys like Daniel Jeremiah from NFL Network. Here are some of the guys the Eagles have had meetings with, according to reports. They've had a meeting with Jalen Reagor. Now, that name may sound familiar to some of you. Jalen Reagor's father played for the Eagles. He was at TCU last year. Van Jefferson from Florida. Not just Jefferson, Van Jefferson. His dad is a coach, a wide receivers coach in the NFL. Another guy the Eagles have met with is KJ Hamler of Penn State. We have not heard a lot of reports of them meeting with Ruggs. We have heard of them potentially talking to Justin Jefferson at the draft combine. So you can get a full list at 97.3 ESPN.com of names that Sal Paolantonio gave Mike Gill on the Sports Bash. But combining the names that Sal Pal had and with other people who are reporting, I'm not seeing a lot of people saying that Ruggs has consistently been a guy that they've been talking to, because of the fact that I think there's an assumption that someone is going to take him high. So of the guys we mentioned, Justin Jefferson, KJ Hamler, Jalen Reagor, do any of those guys appeal to you, Ryan, or does it just feel like the Eagles might be settling?
Like if they get Jefferson, would you say, is that what you're saying? Would Justin Jefferson be a settle?
Right, like if they walked away with Denzel Mims instead of Henry Ruggs. Okay, he's a guy that Sal Paolantonio mentioned. Is that a guy that do you feel, let down that they would get a guy like that instead of Ruggs? Or do you feel like, he's still a good player, he's still a good option?
I think this is a cop-out answer. I mean, you can call me out on it, but doesn't it just depend on what happens around them? Like for me, the Jaguars, what are they going to do? The Cowboys, what are they going to do? Like Justin Jefferson at 21, depending on who's remaining on the board and what teams slightly behind the Eagles and slightly ahead of them, what those teams do, I mean, that's really going to impact how I evaluate the first pick that they make in the draft. I'm sorry. I know that's somewhat of a cop-out, but Justin Jefferson feels safe. I don't know why. Do you agree with that? He just feels safe. I'm not saying I'm hating on it, but I would just be like, okay, I'm satisfied. It's not wowing me. There's not a ton of risk there, but that was the best option. That's a guy that Howie's liked. How do you feel about it?
So he feels safe on the surface. I agree 100% because if you're someone who watched college football games, he is a guy that stood out at LSU in that spread pro-style offense. My only concern with Jefferson is I've heard multiple people who are analysts refer to him as a better slot receiver than outside receiver. And I think the thing the Eagles need is an outside receiver. They need a guy on the outside who can stretch the defense. So if Deshaun Jackson gets injured again or teams double D-Jax over the top, there's another guy that can clear out space for guys like Ertz and Goddard over the middle and on the out routes.
If you're Howie Roseman, though, Josh, and we're just looking at the wide receiver position in this hypothetical question, what's the most important style of wide receiver the Eagles need to acquire? Is it the speed? I mean,
yes,
you do.
I say 100%. It has to be the speed.
But let me just throw this in there real quick, because you have Deshaun Jackson, all right? And I'm not saying I disagree with you with the speed answer, but if you're Howie Roseman, you just paid Deshaun Jackson a lot of money. You just spent an entire season without him. Forget week 1 against the Redskins. You had an entire year with Jackson not suiting up. So do you roll the dice a little bit and you say, I have the speed. I have the speed. Now, how do the Eagles offense and that dynamic, how is that really going to look if you add another speed guy and the Eagles get a little bit lucky, so to speak, and D-Jax is healthy all year?
Then you have 2 speed guys. I think that you, in today's NFL, spread offenses and cornerbacks who really can't cover very well anymore. I mean, cornerbacks today are nowhere as good as there's no Deion Sanders in the NFL anymore. There's no elite. There's not a ton of elite speed guys at corner anymore. Great cover guys. So, to me, the more speed you have to clear out space, and the more speed that puts pressure on defenses, the better. So, to me, if you can walk out of this draft with a KJ Hamler, for example, a guy that people say at the high end is T.Y. Hilton, and on the low end is Philip Dorsett, that's a pretty good pick. If you walk out of there, for example, as I mentioned, a guy like Denzel Mims. People say that Denzel Mims is the best route runner to come out of Baylor ever. Okay, well, if that's the case, and he runs a 4.38 and he's 6'2", I'm good with that. Maybe he doesn't play week 1 as a starter, but maybe he develops into the next star receiver for you. I think that you got to prioritize speed, Ryan, because when you have tight ends like Ertz and Goddard and a slot guy, whether it's Greg Ward or somebody else, you got to factor in that you need the speed to clear out the field for the rest of the guys.
I'm with you. I'm completely with you, but I just think you mentioned the tight end spot and Dallas Goedert, Zach Ertz. And fair or foul, it seems like whenever Doug Peterson and the Eagles offense has been forced to simplify things a little bit, their offense is operated the most effectively when they really utilize the 2 tight end sets, when they utilize Goddard, when they utilize Ertz, and you still have that speed guy on the outside, hopefully in Deshaun Jackson. I'm just intrigued and maybe slightly worried on how the offense will look with D-Jax on one side, another speed guy on the other. What's the identity of this offense? We haven't really seen Wentz push the ball down the field yet wearing an Eagles jersey. It's just Foles did it a little bit during that run. Outside of that, it's been a lot of dink and dunk, has it not?
It has, but I think because they haven't had the option. Like, if you, and we'll say this before we hit the break, more text, please bring him in, 609-403-0973. Peterson's from the Andy Reid tree. The Chiefs won the Super Bowl with not 1, not 2, but 3 and 4 speed receivers. Tyreek Hill, Sammy Watkins, McCole Hardman, and they still had the tight end underneath as well. So I think that if we're looking at Andy Reid and saying that's the blueprint of the Doug Peterson offense, and the Chiefs just won a Super Bowl with that style of players on the field, I don't see why the Eagles wouldn't thrive with those receivers as well.
I hope you're right. And like I said before, I don't really disagree with anything you're saying. I agree. I just think it's an unknown. And once again, the end of the day, you really don't know how he's thinking and how he's going to decide to filter through this year's unique NFL draft.
609-403-0973 is text board to get on the conversation. Josh Hennig, Ryan Rothstein here on 97.3 ESPN. Don't forget the NFL draft, April 23rd, starts right here on 97.3 ESPN. You can hear all rounds of the NFL draft right here on 97.3 ESPN. Maybe you don't want to, hey, listen, maybe, Ryan, you don't want to hear the people on TV. Maybe you don't like Mel Kiper. Maybe you don't want to hear those people on TV. You could always put the radio on and then watch the draft as you go along with the radio, whether on your radio or on the 97.3 ESPN mobile app.
Yeah, sometimes you don't want to hear Mel Kiper yell, Todd, 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 Todd.
Josh Hennig, Ryan Rothstein. Also coming up next, what veteran running back wants to be with the Eagles? How would that impact the Eagles' draft day strategy? We'll get into that coming up next here on 97.3 ESPN FM and the 97.3 ESPN mobile app. Josh Hennig, Ryan Rothstein here. Running back, Ryan, is an interesting question because Jordan Howard left to go to Miami. We already have Miles Sanders. People love Boston Scott. But what else are they going to do? We know they have Elijah Holyfield on a futures contract. They had him in practice squad last year. But there are reports, Ryan, that LaShawn McCoy is interested in returning to the Eagles. So, Ryan Rothstein, I ask you, if you're the Philadelphia Eagles, do you take less of a look at running back in the draft if you think you could get McCoy on a veteran's minimum and bring him in the camp? Maybe you don't look as many running backs in the mid rounds, maybe only the later rounds, because you want to bring in a guy to compete with McCoy for that third slot.
I don't know if that's the question, because here's my answer to that. It just seems like Shady is going to be an Eagle, and it just seems like it's going to happen soon. All right, so McCoy in January, I believe he told Jeff McClain of the Philadelphia Inquirer that he plans on finishing his career as a Philadelphia Eagle. He was even quoted to say, teammates and friends on other teams that I've played on since playing for the Eagles, it's like everyone knows that I'm going to at some point go back to Philly. Like, I'm paraphrasing what he said, but That's essentially what Shady said. Then recently, it was a couple days ago, he comes out and says he's only playing 2 more years. He plans to play 2 more years. So he's on the record at 2 separate times saying he's going to finish confidently, stating he's going to finish his career as an Eagle. And now he says he only has really 2 more years left in the tank. So I take those 2 quotes and I say he's most likely willing to come to Philly on a veteran's minimum, maybe in a lesser role for lesser money, in order to finish his career in Philly. So then you have a veteran there that can come in, and I think you should still be somewhat aggressive in the draft, because then you can bring in a guy that won't compete against Shady, Josh, but he'll compete against Boston Scott. I think that all makes sense.
A couple running backs the Eagles have already met with who are available in the draft include LaMichael Pirine of Florida. He's more of a physical running back, 5'10", 216. They also have met with Raymond Calais of Louisiana. He's more of a speed back like Boston Scott, 5'7", runs a 4.4 40. They've also met with Rico Dowdle from South Carolina, more of a physical running back, 5'11", 213. So they have already looked at a variety of different running backs, Ryan. A lot of projections have the Eagles taking potentially A.J. Dillon, a big bruising back from Boston College. So, maybe the Eagles are following what you're saying, which is LaShawn McCoy might not have an effect on who they actually pick.
Do you think it would? Like, if the Eagles land him, is that going to impact their decisions?
My opinion would be I would love to see them do nothing with running back until after the draft when it comes to free agent signings. I think that they should let the draft play out, and if a certain guy falls to them or is in a position for them to get him, like a P. Ryan of Florida. I love P. Ryan from Florida. I love Dillon from Boston College personally. Heck, I would love to see them get Malcolm Perry, the former Navy quarterback. That dude is a speed merchant. Move him to running back and let him do kick and punt returns. I would love to see that. I would love to see the Eagles try to say, look, Who cares about McCoy right now in the draft? Let's let the draft play out. And then when the draft is over, talk to LaShawn.
I think these are questions that we need answered, which are the following. Miles Sanders, how much of a role is he realistically going to have? And it sounds crazy, but we all know Doug Peterson is running back by committee. He loves having three guys, at least two, typically three guys, to have legitimate roles in the offense. So what are the Eagles' plans with Miles Sanders? Are they willing to give him a heavy workload? What are the realistic plans for Boston Scott? Is he going to be a legitimate piece in that committee approach? And then how do you fill that third spot? Or is Boston Scott not a guy you believe in yet if you're Doug and Howie? I think those are things I struggle to answer. Do you find the same thing?
The only thing I know for sure, and obviously neither one of us are in the actual meeting rooms, but Doug Peterson said multiple times that Boston Scott was taking the Darren Sproles role in the offense. And the way they used Miles Sanders as a running back and a receiver tells me that those two are projected to have roles in the roster next year. But beyond that, I don't think anything is certain.
Nothing's ever certain with Howie Roseman and the Philadelphia Eagles.
Ryan, your Twitter is
Ryan973 ESPN.
I am at Josh Hennig, HENNIG.